For many Americans, there's no escaping the Vietnam War. I grew up in the shadow of the war, like a lot of our listeners, but for many of our listeners, Gen X, greatest generation, baby boomers, Vietnam was a lived experience. And that's not just for the soldiers who went and fought, survived, lost their lives over there, but for the people here who had to understand what the war was about, tried to understand it, whether they supported it or were against it politically or not, however they felt about the draft, however they felt about the Vietnamese people, communism, how they were being sold on the war. Saigon falls, about 50 years ago, 48 years ago. In fact, this year, 2023, marks the 50th anniversary of the American exit from Vietnam. So I thought what I might want to do is talk this week about the Vietnam War and do that in a couple different ways. Today on the podcast, we're talking to Dr. Rob Thompson, who has recently written a book on the Vietnam War. He's a scholar of the war itself. He wrote a book published through University of Oklahoma Press called Clear, Hold, and Destroy, Pacification in Phú Yên and the American War in Vietnam. And you'll often find Rob by @Dr. Rob Thompson on Twitter talking about Vietnam, its memory, what happened over there, and of course any other number of things. Historians are not just historians of their specific era. You'll often hear me talk about other things, but Vietnam's important, right? It's this touch point that, say, for me, even though I was born, say, 2 years after Saigon, I grew up in the shadow of Vietnam. I know a lot of you did. And so for those of you in your 20s or 30s who are listening to this, maybe you grew up in the shadow of Vietnam, or maybe you're growing up in the shadow of 9/11. That seems to be the closest thing to it. And many of our cultural touch points are based in Vietnam. I remember there was just no escaping this war in the 1980s, going from Bruce Springsteen's music to Rambo to any number of films. In fact, the movie that we're talking about today, Platoon, and also the movie that we're going to be showing on HATM this weekend on Sunday night on Amazon Prime, Hamburger Hill, came out during this, what I refer to as golden age of Vietnam War films, this era of, say, 82 to 89, in which the United States cinema culture got really interested in talking about Vietnam, what it meant, and really coming to terms with going to war over there, and arguably losing the war in Vietnam. And that's something we're going to talk to Rob about today. So Platoon becomes this really important film. It wins Best Picture, I think, in 86. It's largely based off of Oliver Stone's own experiences in Vietnam. The film does a lot in a very short amount of time. Whenever you go back to watch this film, it's got a pretty strong critique about Vietnam, about the loss of innocence of Americans who are going to Vietnam. And even though we don't see the homeland, we don't see the American homeland during the war, you get a sense of what's going on back in the United States as well. So, introduces a lot of us, at least to me. Introduce me to Charlie Sheen, to Tom Berenger, to Willem Dafoe, I will always see as Elias, no matter if he's chasing Spider-Man or stuck in a lighthouse with any number of guys. That's Elias, right? So this movie becomes etched in my memory, and I really wanted to talk about it. We've already done a bunch of films on HATM. If you come along with the Sunday night thing that we've done over the last 5 years, we've shown a bunch of movies on HATM, including Platoon. We've done We Were Soldiers, and of course, Full Metal Jacket. We've done The Five Bloods, more recent film by Spike Lee that kind of goes back and touches on Vietnam. And of course, a whole lot of films, like we said, on the 80s. Even Top Gun talks about Vietnam. So there was no getting away from the war, at least for a long time. And then sometime around the late 90s, we start to see this swing back towards interest in, say, World War II with Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers, and a whole slew of other films that come out after that. So I'm interested to see where Vietnam remains in the cultural memory here in the United States. And I'm looking forward to your thoughts on this podcast. So I hope you sit back and relax and enjoy. Rob has a bunch of ideas about Platoon. We get into a whole bunch of stuff. I hope you enjoyed the talk today. So sit back and relax. Platoon is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Rob Thompson, what's going on, buddy? How are you today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me here, Jason.
Dude, I am so excited. I've been wanting to get you on the pod for a while because you're like my Vietnam guy. Whenever I have questions about Vietnam, I'm like, Rob, what had happened? Like my buddy, so growing up, my best friend, Jesse Maupin, I would go to his house and his father was a vet. And Don, his dad, he passed a few years ago. Pops, we always call him, would even talk to us about these stories. So a lot of guys like me, probably yourself as well, I'm 45, we kind of grew up in the shadow of Vietnam. And so much of what I understood about childhood came through the films and things like that, either directly about Vietnam, like Platoon, like what we're talking about today, or any number of other movies that, the more I watch movies from the era, it's like, oh my God, everything is a reflection of this goddamn war. So I am super excited to talk to you about the war itself, memory, all this kind of stuff. So I'm so glad you're here. This is gonna be really cool.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. And yeah, like a similar background, kind of growing up with Vietnam, kind of always there, but not knowing it till like much later on. I looked back and was like, oh yeah, my uncle's a Vietnam vet. My dad joined the Army in 1979, 1980, when it was insanely unpopular to go into the Army because of Vietnam. So my dad was part of like the new Army, and all that was because of Vietnam. So it was not, I wouldn't say fortuitous, just like interesting that I came around to studying this war. And also a lot because like my uncle wouldn't talk about it. We all knew he was a Vietnam vet, but he was the kind of that classic vet, came back and it was like, life goes forward and that's behind me. So he didn't really talk a lot about it other than some quips here or there. Once I got more into it, and probably also with his age, he's opened up a little bit more. I think it surprised him that my generation and the younger generations actually like want to know about it, because he grew up with it as being this, not necessarily maybe mistake, but this scar, and no one wanted to see it. I don't even know if he's ever actually seen Platoon or the films, but I guess that's my long way of saying that Vietnam was like always there and I didn't quite recognize it. Even like my cousins, his daughter and sons kind of like would mention or reference it, so they were aware of what their dad had done. But I mean, no one knew like, what did Uncle George do in Vietnam? Everyone's like, he was a soldier. And it wasn't until like much later on that we learned far more about it, where he was, or he like, like all those like details came out much later on. It wasn't like the Greatest Generation where you knew like, oh yeah, my so-and-so relative was there at this theater.
Or they're in Bastogne or whatever, right?
Yeah. We just like, oh yeah, he was in Vietnam.
Yeah, it's a different relationship to this conflict, right? And so much of like American history is in some ways shaped by our own, I mean, kind of sadly, I guess, shaped by our experience in, warfare, whether it's the American Revolution or the Civil War, or even wars against indigenous folks, or Vietnam, World War II. And of course, now we got this whole other war on terror, which I want to ask you about like a little bit later on about, students and, people you talked about to, because their relationship, I would imagine, contemporary students' relationships to Vietnam might be kind of like what our relationship was to maybe World War II. This thing that you heard about, but it was way in the past.
Yeah, in a way, I gave 2 guest lectures over at SAM, so like the grad school that's a part of CGSC at Fort Leavenworth, and I gave one lecture on 1965 and one lecture on 1970, and these are 2 officers who may have some experience in Iraq or Afghanistan, and that's kind of like their frame of reference. And they may know a little bit about Vietnam, but what really matters to them is that a lot of this has happened before. Like what they experienced in Iraq and Afghanistan already had happened in Vietnam. Like they repeated a lot of it. So that's what like matters to them is like, wait, we did this. It didn't work out so well before, but we did it again. And
Right.
so they're like, where are the lessons learned? And what do you mean, like, no more Vietnams? Like, we did it again and again. So they were coming at it from like this, where was this knowledge? Why wasn't it like passed on or distributed correctly? So they're not coming from like this point of ignorance. They're coming from a point of like, why wasn't more of it widely looked at, and why weren't we spending more time studying it like we keep doing with World War II?
Well, let me ask you this as far as point of info, because I'm looking over your left shoulder. I want you to talk to our audience a little bit. So people who don't know anything about you or just coming to this particular podcast, over your left shoulder, I'm seeing Clear, Hold, and Destroy, which is your book that came out, was it last year?
2021.
2021. So talk to us a little bit about like what it is that you do and like why you're here on the pod.
Okay, so in 2021, my book Clear, Hold, and Destroy came out through Oklahoma University Press. This month, actually, it's now in paperback form. I guess that's a big deal. So people tell me, cool, it's a little bit cheaper now if you want it in paperback. The book in general is the book version of my dissertation. So I've been studying Phú Yên province for too long, maybe. I got really immersed in it, basically because in grad school, I went to the University of Southern Mississippi. My advisors there, Dr. Andy Wiest and Heather Sturr, kind of pushed me towards looking at papers we had on the province. And I love having a question that just like racks my brain. And this province went to hell. And the papers we have were 71. And I was like, if the province was that shitty in that 1 year, how did it get there? Did anyone try to stop it? So I had all these questions. And every time I thought I had an answer, I realized I just had more questions. And so I couldn't stop digging. When it came to the actually writing the dissertation, Andy had to tell me to stop going to the archive and to start writing
Right.
because
Yeah.
I just kept getting all this great information to the point where I was like, I don't know if I could use it all because I just had rabbit holes. I could have gone so many directions, but for me, I wanted to know what was pacification in Vietnam, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but mainly why did the war go so badly in one place, and is that in any way indicative of the war in general? So I had to explain what pacification was, and that was this idea of providing security. I realized that that's what the war was all about, but yet no one agreed on what pacification meant, and that was kind of hard then to
Mm-hmm.
fight a war when there's this idea that they kind of all agree on, but yet they keep changing what it means. So I looked at that, especially early on during the foundational like stages of planning a strategy and helping guide the South Vietnamese, where they're constantly going, well, I think pacification means this. Well, maybe it means that. And then there might be some agreement, but then within a year, they'd already be saying, well, no, actually it means this. But then they're fighting the war. And so I was like, oh my God, it's just like this mess. And then I realized I enjoyed how messy it was. And I think that's what really got me hooked on to the Vietnam War, was that not only was it a mess physically, but in terms of like the archival stuff, everything happening behind the scenes, it's just this mess. And so there's all these narratives, all these things anyone could like try to create a story from, but it can be maddening because we do have these like these larger ideas of what the war was, and sometimes if you mess around with those, you're like, oh no, you like people get really defensive because a lot of people are still alive from that time. So that's the other thing I had to worry about. Like people care about this because it's their history. They were there. So I did some interviews and you had to deal with, well, we were winning when I was there, a lot of that stuff. And so it was like a carousel of skeletons and all this stuff, trying to put it all together. And like, I was surprised at the end that I actually had something that was coherent, because at some points I'm like, I don't know what's going on. And so I think at least by the time the book came out, I could finally like say what was going on. And it was just, to me, like trying to create a safe environment, and there's illusions of it, and then kind of just running with that illusion And then even when stuff fell apart, it was kind of like, well, too bad, we're leaving anyway. And that was it. That's like the easiest way to explain it, because nothing was going to stop the US from leaving.
So it does kind of feel like, in a sense, that like there's the American War experience, all kind of wrapped up in the history of this one particular province, as far as the messiness. And you talk about, the covert aspect of it. I know that in, the film in Platoon, there's this whole line about, hey, aren't we in Cambodia right now? And shouldn't we not be here? The whole war, all the way going back to, say, Johnson's secret escalation of the war, a mess. I mean, the war was a mess for Americans. And obviously, I would imagine for very much, and I'm not a Vietnam expert, but for Vietnamese folks as well, who, and of course, they're still dealing with the war, right? I mean, Agent Orange is still a thing for people in Vietnam to deal with, as well as survivors here in the United States. I know that a lot of folks are still like receiving treatment for exposure to that. We're still very much living as a global society with Vietnam, 50 years later?
Yeah. I can remember when we were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. And now we're in that period of like 50 years since the end of Vietnam. So, yeah. And we're definitely still, Vietnam is still in that period of, you could say, like recovery in a sense. They're still looking for North Vietnamese war dead. There's still the environmental aspect. They're still dealing with the effects of chemical warfare. Deforestation had a huge impact on the environment. Not like that. There's the economic part alone from being isolated after the war.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was probably one of the more easy things to remedy. But I mean, now we're even like entering that period where relations between Vietnam and the U.S. are a little bit better. Neither side really likes what China's up to, and now we're like, wait, could the U.S. and Vietnam be closer friends? Could we actually be friends? And so it's like all within like 50 years, but there's still a lot of stuff, like a lot of things.
Those memories are still alive, right?
Yeah.
Of that nasty war.
Yeah, my uncle's still alive. There's a lot of that still alive. Kissinger's still alive.
How is that even possible? It's like he's about to turn 100.
People keep asking me, honestly, I don't know.
The end of the world is just going to be, cockroaches and Kissinger or something. I don't know. I got an important question for you. Coke or Pepsi?
Ooh, Coke.
All right, good. We're just marching them off the, we talk about a Cold War, that's.
Yeah, you had to do the Cola Wars.
Yeah. So when we were talking initially, I was like, hey, you want to do a movie on Vietnam? You were like, yeah, absolutely. And then we had to choose one of the, 600,000 movies that were made about Vietnam, or movies that reflect Vietnam. And that's just movies made in the United States. I would love to see movies made in Vietnam talking about the war itself, like that reflect on these same topics. But we pretty quickly settled on Platoon. I don't know for any other reason that I think you and I just have seen it a whole bunch. But Why Platoon? Like, where does Platoon exist when we talk about Vietnam films? Like, why do we come back to Platoon so often?
I think Platoon is like that interesting one because it's like it's like made like not long after the war. It feels like Vietnam in it. It catches the climate, like the heat, the humidity, the look, people speaking Vietnamese, but then it has that quintessential like good versus evil dichotomy going on. There's actually like some good, like Americans trying to be good, and then you have some Americans that are just downright evil. I could see like there's some like My Lai massacre type stuff going on there. So it's a movie that's trying to address so many different things in like one unit and one like campaign. And there's like so much going on in like 2 hours. And it kind of does it kind of seamlessly. It's like, there's a lot going on, but at no point are you like, okay, this is getting ridiculous. There's way too much. So it might be that it does a lot, but in a way that you're like, wow, this seems so plausible.
Yeah, this is obviously taken from Oliver Stone's own experiences as a soldier in Vietnam. It's somewhat semi-autobiographical as far as Charlie Sheen's character is clearly based on Stone. And you're right? In a lot of ways, I think this is Stone's best film. Like, in the way that it's shot, the story that it's trying to tell. It is very much a fall of innocence. We see Chris enter this war, this very much innocent young man coming into this war, a volunteer. He's somewhat naive coming into this, and like you said, quickly brought into this this tug of war between good and evil. And these Vietnam War movies, there's obviously this. We see Hamburger Hill at about the same time. Obviously we think we could talk about Apocalypse Now. We could talk about Full Metal Jacket. These movies feel different than, say, traditional American war movies because none of these are raw American films, are they? I mean, you talk about good versus evil, and neither one of us thought, oh, Americans are good here, right? This is not the story it's trying to tell.
You're right. Good doesn't triumph, really. You don't get that feeling. You get, you see, the Charlie Sheen's character, Chris, kind of fall into that evil side, but then he comes back to, the good side. But at the end, you see him just a shell of himself. I just have to get through this.
He's lost himself.
And you're just oh, okay. He's become the guy who's definitely just counting down the days to get out of there. And again, it's not like a traditional American war film in that there's they're dealing with race, not just how the Americans are interacting with the Vietnamese, but how there's African American soldiers along with really racist American soldiers. There's class. I mean, the unit's divided almost between race and class lines. So there's all this display of American society within that one American unit. But then we're also looking at the breakdown of chain of command and then from the military perspective. So all these problems are being addressed in one film. And I don't think you usually get that and feel good American story. You don't get that in We Were Soldiers.
No, you don't. And you don't. The comparison I always try to make to this is actually a Green Berets, which is that rah that John Wayne. I think comes out in 65, 60. It comes out during the war, does it not?
I think so.
And very pro patriotic, rah Americans are great. And this movie has so much to say, like you're just saying, not only about the war itself, but more. It's much about the United States and this internal conflict that the United States is having over the war. I don't know that another movie does it this well. And of course, not every movie's trying to do the same thing, but what this film does is you're talking about, these conversations about race and class and, where African American soldiers are doing and being treated differently than, say, whites. And they're all poor, except for maybe Chris, who's the college dropout. It's a hell of a thing. Does the film itself, does this take place in the province that you studied? Are the events of the film, are you familiar with roughly what happened during the war itself?
I was trying to focus on that a lot. So I know Phú Yên is on the coast, so rather removed from where they're saying this is all taking place. So they mentioned Cambodia. So I know they're well into the interior on the border. And I was trying to, figure out if that's where their division was operating at. And I was trying to think, well, they're at 1967. Is that really what they're doing at the time? And I was trying to think well, maybe those details really don't necessarily matter because they're trying to tell you a believable war story. And if they get wrapped up in those details, then that's probably not going to work out. The only one that didn't hold up to me is when they get attacked by the enemy. Just because I was I'm not sure if that is how it would have played out if the enemy was going to take a chance on fighting the Americans on the American terms.
Are you talking about the big climactic battle towards the end?
Yeah. I'm especially if they have their own the bunker complex and everything, I think it would have been the other way around in 67. I could be mistaken. But as far as I know, that's usually not how it happened. That's the only detail, but I understand why they did it because they needed that chaos. They needed to portray some of the American characters as cowardly. I forget that one guy who hides under the dead body.
Oh yeah, by John C. McGinley plays that character, right? Where he's he's hiding down. He's constantly afraid he's gonna get killed in the war. He obviously survives, but yeah, I mean you see that, you see a few guys running and so forth towards the battle. I have no idea what I would do during battle, so I'm definitely not.
Yeah, so I'm not going to pass judgment.
No,
especially if those guys have been there for a long time. It was like an interesting to portray these guys who are acting like really tough for that sergeant major, but then like when this moment, like this test comes, they break.
Yeah.
And it's guys like Chris who rise to the occasion. And so there's an interesting like play. I just don't know historically if the communists would have thrown themselves at the Americans, knowing full well the firepower they were going to face. That just is not how they would have acted. But then I don't know for sure. I mean, there could always be an outlier.
Well, I think almost in the way that this film is being shot and told, it's the Vietnamese. I think it's the NVA who they're fighting. Correct? It's the North Vietnamese Army at the end of the battle. Exists as far as a storytelling device as a mechanism to illustrate the decline and fall of American innocence, towards the war. And during the war, of course, none better, I think, illustrated than Willem Dafoe's Elias being killed, which I think is still the most difficult scene to watch in the film. I can't see, and there's all this stuff about Willem Dafoe. He's been in the Spider-Man movies, he's been in this, he's been in that. I can't look at Willem Dafoe and not see Sergeant Elias. This is not a thing I can do. That was the very first time I ever saw Dafoe. I know a lot of people often consider him as an actor who plays on villainous roles, but I can't see him as anything other than Sergeant Elias. Cannot do it.
Yeah, I mean, he does that character like so well. I mean, the most iconic scene is him dying.
Yeah, the arms open with the music.
And the whole time, I'm like, every time I watch it, I'm like, oh, man, that scene's coming up. The only scene I probably dislike more is when they're going through the Vietnamese village and ransacking it, just because I know some of the atrocities they're going to commit, and that I know that isn't something fabricated just for storytelling. And so for me, that's the part that hits home the hardest. And yet a much older historian me now appreciates that being in the film. I think when I first saw this, the younger me was like, oh God, no one needs to see that.
Let's talk about this scene, actually, right? So this scene is obviously a direct reflection of My Lai.
Oh, yeah.
My Lai occurs, late 67, early 68?
Yeah, so this is like perfect, like right around the right time.
Americans don't find out about My Lai for a little while, though.
Yeah, the Army's able to keep it under wraps for, at least a year or so until it finally gets leaked. Then they have to do something public about it. But there's cases of like similar instances. I don't know of anything as huge, but definitely of U.S. soldiers committing crimes throughout Vietnam. I wouldn't say they were rampaging and doing such as grisly as My Lai everywhere, but they were definitely not treating the Vietnamese well. And there's probably investigations that's piling up for the U.S. Army alone to look at. And that was a huge problem for the U.S. was that the Army was just kind of treating the Vietnamese treating every Vietnamese as a potential enemy.
Right. Well, this gets into the whole racist aspect of this war. This becomes a very racialized war at some point in time, where say American soldiers are looking at say any Vietnamese person as a potential enemy. I want to pause there for a quick second though, because it's like I'm interested in My Lai is simply in the idea that obviously My Lai is this horrible, horrific war crime. No one's questioning that or anything like that, but it's certainly not the first war crime in American war history. I would imagine. Is this the first major war crime that American populace becomes aware of? It seems to be like you don't hear of a My Lai. I'm not familiar with My Lai-esque war crimes slipping out, say, during World War II or maybe Korea or something like that, or at least there being a reaction to it. I could be completely wrong here, so if somebody knows better than me, please say so. But is this really the first time that Americans are becoming aware of like this, I don't know, potential of our soldiers onto a civilian populace?
I think we have like a view of like, I don't know, let's say the Second World War, where the U.S. was just liberators, didn't do anything terrible, like we weren't the Germans, that kind of thing. But I think there's like more recent studies that are coming out to be like, the greatest generation wasn't always great. They definitely committed crimes. They definitely weren't on the best behavior all the time. God, I don't know. I don't want to know if it was committed like, well, actually, we can say like they definitely executed Waffen SS. So there was like those extrajudiciary killings of German soldiers.
Hmm.
There are accounts of them raping women. So there's that stuff that kind of is like ignored about the U.S. military in World War II, and that's probably going to come out more and more over time. In Vietnam, I think is like it's a more media covered war, more like independent media
Hmm.
is involved, and so when something finally gets out, it's disseminated quicker, and also that coinciding with the war's unpopularity, everyone's trying to like latch on to something bad. That's not to say that war crimes aren't inherently bad; they just fuel like the anti-war movement more. So the army's trying to keep a lot of stuff under wraps because they know they're under so much scrutiny already. The idea is we'll take care of stuff internally. Probably not the best idea in Vietnam because there's already so much for it to take care of. But My Lai alone showed that there was a lot of endemic problems.
You mentioned a little bit about the war's unpopularity by 68 and 69, certainly. Was the war always unpopular, say, as Americans kind of ramp up their involvement, say, 65 or so? Or was there initially this idea that, hey, we're going in for noble causes?
So that's a great question. So Platoon, I think, nails that with Chris. He's that
Hmm.
guy who volunteers. He wants to do his patriotic duty. He mentions that's what his grandfather and father had done before him. There are accounts of veterans who did that too. They felt like, well, my dad had fought the Nazis, so it's my turn now to fight the communists. And that's like kind of like, it's not uncommon for people joining early on. Maybe 67 is a little bit late, but that's definitely a view held by people joining in like 65, 66, is that they're actually doing something noble. They're going to fight communism. They're going to go help the South Vietnamese. The war gets unpopular starting in 67 when there's no progress towards like any end game. Like the army's saying, "Oh, we're nearing victory," but everyone's like, "Well, what is that victory?" Like, well, all we're seeing is,
What does victory look like in Vietnam?
yeah, everyone watches the nightly news, and you're seeing KIAs, you're seeing
Hmm.
all this violent footage, and it's like, well, where is this victory? What's progress? Like, I don't see progress. And then by 68, with the Tet Offensive, everyone, you get journalists basically saying, "Yeah, this war's lost. It's a lost cause." And basically the anti-war movement just is on steroids. Like it gets all the energy it needs, and then the war is insanely unpopular. And there's definitely nobody going down to the recruiting office saying, "Sign me up for Vietnam."
No, in fact, you're having to be drafted to go into the war, right? This is the last.
Yeah,
This is the last war we have where a draft is part of the conflict. Am I correct? At least for Americans.
it's also the reason why like they won't probably like they're so hesitant to bring back the draft because the draft was so unpopular. The reaction when he tells people like when how do you end up here? Like, oh, I wanted to come here. They're like, what? Like, because at least in 67, like, I mean, like no one in their right mind is going to want to have gone to Vietnam, at least at that point. It's so, especially, it was just a good, I really enjoyed that part because their reaction seemed like so genuine. Like, how did you end up here? Like, you wanted to be here? Like, they didn't want to
Mm.
be here. And yet, he's the only person in that unit who wanted to be there.
I want to ask you about fragging because this is a major portion of the film. Of course, Barnes kills Elias. He murders him. There's no way to say it, right? I mean, he murders Elias. And then, of course, the major part of the film is talking about how Elias's guys are going to get back at Barnes, of course, with Chris ultimately killing Barnes towards the end. Is murder commonplace inside Vietnam War? For the people are, I'm sure most people are familiar with the idea of fragging. But fragging, Rob, if you can probably explain a bit better than I can.
So that kind of correlates with the unpopularity of the war. The army is faced with soldiers who don't want to be there,
Mm-hmm.
and they certainly don't want to die in Vietnam. Particularly as as their tour goes on and they get closer and closer to that day of return to the United States. So I could say the soldiers are reluctant to like an officer, whoever is in charge of them that is, you could say, eager to go out on combat operations, or who they feel doesn't have their best interests at heart. So if that person is, they feel, putting them in danger, there are instances in Vietnam of them rolling grenades into their tents or some other like violent means to like get rid of them. So the Army does have an issue with what would have been then termed like fragging, trying to get rid of your commanding officer because you were focused on either self-preservation or preserving you and your battle buddies, and you saw that person as the direct threat. And so then the Army has this problem with a breakdown in chain of command, that these, say, like short timers, people who are really close to going home, are not going to listen to orders. They're pretty much going to do what they want to do. Combat effectiveness of these units breaks down. And they also then get officers who know that, hey, if I push too hard, I could end up dead.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering how this translates to like the order making mechanism itself, right? Like if a young second lieutenant is kind of having a watch over his shoulder because he's been ordered to take his troops out on recon, and the guys don't want to go, is he still going to make those orders? Like, I mean, is this a common thing that these guys are having to encounter?
I'm not sure how common it is, but it's a big enough of a problem where the media latches onto it, the Army gets concerned about it, and that it's definitely one of those lasting impressions we have of the war. And it's one of those things where when we combine it with like drug use, that when the U.S. Army looks upon its collective ability to fight, period, it realizes that should the Soviet Union decide to launch World War III, it is seriously not going to be able to do much because most of the U.S. Army has been like run into the ground in Vietnam, and that has affected units that are back in Europe. And so whether or not fragging is really a big issue, it's played into the minds of people. It's created this break in morale. And so the Army has suffered regardless. The best way to really look at it is when you start like bundling it up with all these other issues. And there's a reason why Vietnam is such a disaster for like the U.S. and the U.S. Army in general.
You just brought up the Soviet Union, and obviously, I think most of us understand that Vietnam for the Americans is very much a proxy war against the Soviet Union. And I'm kind of wondering, other countries are watching this war against Vietnam, or in Vietnam on the American side. And I'm kind of wondering if you're aware of what other countries are thinking about as they're watching the United States struggle in this war. What do American allies say in England or France or other places? France obviously having a very long history in Vietnam already. But what other countries looking at is the American mystique being shattered here worldwide by their inability to, say, win this war?
So American credibility already kind of got weaker once the French got booted from Vietnam because we supported the French. And then with the war going badly for the Americans in Vietnam, it takes even harder hit, especially because the U.S. is fighting the war even more brutally. So it doesn't look good globally. And also the communist world is much better at propaganda than the U.S. is. So they're helping, in a way, sway anti-war sentiment at home. So the U.S. is losing that PR campaign. France pretty much is against the U.S. war in Vietnam. They didn't like the course the U.S. was taking. They don't like the fact the U.S. is still fighting a war there.
No kidding.
Yeah. So for them,
I had no idea about the French understanding of the war.
Yeah. So they're very much against the U.S. in it. The British don't really care for the U.S. war. West Germany doesn't. So a lot of the European allies see it either as a distraction from what the real problem is, and that's the Soviets in Europe, or as like a potential like blunder that could cause more. I don't know necessarily want to say World War III, but it just seems like the Americans are on a dangerous path. So the global implications aren't really good for the United States when the war goes bad. It's like
You're telling me
ally.
nobody else bought in on domino theory?
The countries that they're able to that buy in are basically the United States' specific partners. Like you get Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, Korea. So they buy into it, but that group comes together like a CETO, and the U.S. keeps trying to play it up as like a strong coalition, trying to brand it as like the Southeast Asian version of NATO.
Right.
But it's not as strong. The rest of the world really just sees it as this U.S. organization with a couple really small powers. Sorry, Australia. But by and large, it's seen as relatively weak. And then CETO like ceases to exist once Saigon falls in 75. Like it pretty much exists solely for the Vietnam War.
And that's it.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about the strengths of this film, the storytelling device, how much of critique of the war and also of the United States this film is able to pack in. I think about 2 hours. Are there weaknesses of this film? Going back, looking at this movie again.
I hate to start at the end, but there's so much going on. But then at the end, with Chris just like saying some things, it's like, oh yeah, I forgot the ending. To me, it just kind of hits dry. I don't know if he's trying to like be preachy, but it's like not memorable. Like for
Right.
me, my mind says the film ends with Sergeant Elias dying, but then I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. We get Chris and the Huey saying some lines,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's like I don't know. That part never made sense to me because to
Right.
me, Sergeant Elias like he's the death of innocence. He's all these things you could argue are wrapped up, and it's right there. And it's like the cinematography and everything. It's like all this effort's put into it, but then it keeps going.
Yeah, I mean, there's quite literally a Jesus-esque kind of sacrifice in Elias. It's a masterful scene. I want to talk about where this movie sets though in the pantheon, because we had growing up in the 80s. I'll say we had growing up in the 80s so many films coming out about Vietnam. And we don't really see Vietnam movies right now. I can't really recall the last movie. Maybe Tigerland with Colin Farrell was the most recent film I've seen on Vietnam. But there was this real, this 5 to 8 year long period where we were seeing, say, the first Rambo film, this movie, Full Metal Jacket, Hamburger Hill, which I think kind of flies under the radar a little bit sometimes when we think about it. And then, of course, there's Flight of the Intruder. Top Gun has allusions to Vietnam. Where does this movie stand in the hierarchy of Vietnam films for you?
My hierarchy always seems to change. Maybe that's because of like I study the war or I watch stuff a lot, and then I see something and I go, oh wow, maybe I don't like that anymore. For the longest time, the one I would have ranked higher, the highest, would have been We Were Soldiers, but
Mm-hmm.
that's dropped because lately I've had to do a lot more on what happened in 65 and I Drang, and I realized that film is like just a fraction of what happened. And yeah, so that one's like dropped. But Platoon, I think after like watching it again, realizing that it does cover a lot, but it does it in such a way you don't realize it's covering a lot. I may not like the very like last minute or two of Charlie Sheen prattling on about stuff I can't remember because I'm like, no, we were done. We had the death of Elias.
Yeah. I don't know how you close Platoon. Yeah.
I would say it's definitely like top three. I always can go back to Full Metal Jacket.
Which feels like two different films.
It does. That's my only like. I get into debates with my coworkers on it because we make documentaries, and I'm like, but how could it? It's two different films, and people will argue which part they like and don't like. Like I like the second part, but almost everybody likes the first part more.
I think it's R. Lee Ermey steals that
Yeah,
film.
and that's what I was to say. Like, well, R. Lee Ermey makes the first part. I'm like, but to me, it's the street fighting and way that makes the second
Mm.
part because like I'm the Vietnam War story. Like I like that realism, and then with the camera crew like moving along as like they're fighting, and I'm like that's the stuff I want to see because it's almost comedic but yet so real.
Soundtrack is really good.
Yeah, and then Apocalypse Now. It's been a while. I remember the last time I watched it, I watched like the extended version. And
I don't have 7 hours to watch that movie. That
I
movie
was
is
like,
so
dear
long.
Lord. But I mean, some of the best lines, I think, out of
The
like any
horror.
Vietnam War film are in
Oh,
that
yeah.
one alone, like Saigon shit. Or
Love a smell of napalm in the morning.
yeah, everyone mentions it. When I say I studied the Vietnam War, they quip that all the time. I'm like,
Of course.
okay. But still it's a great line. But yeah, that's one like I don't know if we needed the extended version.
It's a lot.
It
Of
is.
course, it's starring Charlie Sheen's father, right? As
Yeah.
Martin Sheen.
And so
who is already, and you don't even have like this fall of Martin Sheen, who is already on the edge to start this film off, and then they send him even deeper.
yeah.
It's that film.
So maybe those are like the top 3.
Did you see The Five Bloods?
Yeah, I watched when you had that one on Historians at the Movies.
Yeah,
I watched it. I was excited, but that one to me just needed more editing.
Yeah,
because that was a film that I kind of got lost in. Like I appreciated what it was doing with race. I loved that. Parts really felt like I was in Vietnam.
this idea of going back to Vietnam,
That was cool. But then it kind of like I was like, but is this a treasure hunt? And so there was like some like, and I was like, wait, we could have really edited this down. And so like I just came away going, that movie could have been a lot shorter and maybe I would have liked it more. But I sometimes forget about it when we talk about Vietnam War movies just because maybe a third of it felt like a Vietnam War movie.
Yeah, well, it's much more dealing with like relationships between these guys. It's certainly a film that maybe a little bit more if we're talking about the difference between history and memory, it seems like maybe that one's focusing more on memory. These guys are going back and remembering their time in the war. Of course, I think the interesting thing that Spike Lee does with that is, you've got these older actors, including, the late Chadwick Boseman. These guys are like, when they show these flashback scenes, it's the older guys fighting alongside their fallen, their fallen comrade, which I thought was an interesting narrative device. But yeah, aside from that, though, we don't see a lot of Vietnam films. Instead, we've got this transition now from like, there seems to be since, say, Band of Brothers, or really, I guess maybe since Saving Private Ryan, there seems to be this renewed look again towards World War II.
Yeah. And I mean, it kind of mirrors like the U.S. Army is always going back into World War II. And I think it's like this social or cultural thing where we're always going back because we see it as a success. We see it as noble and we did all this good. We did it right because we win. It's like, I don't know if it'll ever end.
It's a story people naturally want to go hear, right? Because it's an easily, okay, there's a Hitler, and of course, usually the World War II films we see are European theater. We don't often see the Pacific, although we do on occasion. But it seems most of them are shot now in that sepia-toned, look where we're seeing the invasion of Normandy or Bastogne or some other place, or, entering the Eagle's Nest or whatever. And you're right? Like when you look at, say, for predominantly white audiences, you don't have to feel weird about race relations when it comes to fighting against Germans who look like just like a lot of these audiences do. You're absolutely right. And it gets back to like this whole very racist war the United States ended up fighting. We talk about the language that's used against Vietnamese people, used to dehumanize them. Of course, language obviously always used to dehumanize folks, right? It's tough. Are we going to see Korean films? And I try to think at some point in time, both my grandfather and my late grandfather-in-law served during Korea, but I don't see Korea films. I can't even name a Korea film now that I think of it.
I'm trying to remember. I know like South Korea has made some. That are on Netflix.
Really? That would be interesting to pull something up.
I can't remember the names. They popped up, and I was like, "What?" There's one with Liam Neeson playing MacArthur.
I'm gonna have to take a look at this and get this on the register, because that war, we often call it the Forgotten War, and obvious reasons why, right?
Yeah, So I know that obviously they're very much into making movies about it. I guess for us that it's just maybe the same, probably even more so than Vietnam. It's like, okay, it ended in a stalemate. What did we get out of it? There's no like big victory parade in a place like Berlin.
There's no obvious conclusion.
Yeah, so that's why I think we're looking at. Let's go back to World War II, the Greatest Generation, forgetting that they were also the ones in Korea.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned stalemate in Korea. Did the United States lose the war in Vietnam? How do we categorize this war? Is it a loss? Is it a victory? Is it a draw? How, we talk about this war.
I think they were, at least under Nixon, I think they were hoping for like a Korea type draw. And that, okay, as much as that would probably stink, at least it was like, that's what like peace with honor kind of would give you. Like,
Right.
okay, there's a South Vietnam and a North Vietnam. All right, we'll let time figure the rest out. But I think once Saigon falls to North Vietnam in April 75, the U.S. loses. I think, because I mean, the whole point of having South Vietnam was that there's this bastion of emergent democracy in Southeast Asia. The U.S. had spent God knows how much money and blood there and all this like diplomatic capital, and then it's gone. And so it's like, well, it's definitely not a win. And the fact that it's gone, I would say the idea of it being a drawn is off the table. So it's a loss, and everyone has felt like it's a loss. The South Vietnamese people definitely felt like it's a loss. The refugees over here, they're here because their home isn't what it was. So I would definitely characterize it as a loss. Unfortunately, we don't like learning from losses as much as we like learning from victories. And I think that's a big problem. I don't know if that'll ever change, because I think I think by and large people like to feel good. Like they like that feel good story of we liberated France or we brought the war to Japan. I think they like, oh yeah, we like that. We got up off our knees and we brought the war to the Axis and we won. I don't think they like the idea of like, but then the Greatest Generation brought a war to Vietnam, and this enemy we didn't understand brought us to our knees, and we kind of just scampered away and looked the other. And yeah, we don't want to talk about that and really learn.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you the big question here for our audience here. Is Platoon a history film?
Well, I would not watch it to learn what the 25th Infantry Division was doing or what the command climate was like in Vietnam or tactics. Like, and I would use it more as a lens into the history. One, does this get you interested into the war? And then what parts? And in that way, it can be like a history film. Don't come away thinking that in 67, the United States was operating in Cambodia, like a convention. The CIA may have been, but the U.S. Army wasn't. So like, don't like go to your Vietnam War lecture and go like, well, actually no, that's not going to help you. But it can guide you knowing like, yeah, there were race problems. There was rampant drug use. Not as bad in 67 as it was later. There was widespread alcohol all the time. You had to make the soldiers happy. There was definitely problems with how the U.S. soldiers interacted with Vietnamese, suspecting them all of being either Viet Cong or working with the Viet Cong, or just generally untrustworthy because they were not white Americans. Like there was like that racial component that fueled the racism that then fueled so many things. So I think Platoon is a good way to get a taste for all these different things and get you into the Vietnam War, or maybe at least the state of like the U.S. Army during the war. Like maybe that's something you're interested in. Platoon gets at that well too, especially if you look at the relationship between the various platoon leaders and then their commanding officer who just didn't know what he was doing, just shirked responsibility. And
Lieutenant Wolf.
Wolf, like you're like, oh yeah, he's so forgettable.
Well, let me ask you this, Rob. Where can people find you on Twitter where they can't forget you?
Well, I am on Twitter. I'm at Dr. Rob Thompson. So find my profile. You got links to my webpage. You can find the book there. But yeah, once you find me on Twitter, you can pretty much find me everywhere.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much for being here today. I can't thank you enough. We'll have to come back in here and do some more of these because we got one Vietnam War film down. I don't know, 652 more to go, something like that. I mean, no shortage.
There's a bunch, and some my coworkers have seen some more of the obscure ones. Like apparently, there's French ones on the first Indochina War that they shot.
I think those would be phenomenal.
They shot them with live ammunition during the Vietnam War. Something insane, because the French director was like, it has to be real and it's cheaper. And so like all these I'm like, I have to find it. So my coworker's trying to track down a DVD. I'm like, so there's like a whole other like world of like films by the French. And like, I grew up only knowing like the ones the Americans made in the 80s. And I had no idea that there's foreign films that are just as out there.
I think it'd be really cool to maybe see some other reflections on Vietnam outside the United States to see, what these viewpoints are, and I know that we've seen a little bit of that with, say, some of the films that maybe have been produced about World War II more recently. But yeah, I mean, this is a conflict that I think will continue to, it'll continue to inform our experiences for a long time to come. This is what you and I grew up in the shadow of this war. New generations are growing up in the shadow of new wars, which will probably inform their experiences.
Definitely.
I think it's important to understand it, right? From a cultural perspective, self-identity, all kinds of things. So I couldn't thank you enough for being here, man. Really, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks again.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you all to everyone for jumping in and listening today. Thank you to our guest, Rob Thompson, for stopping by the HATM studios, somewhat virtually, to talk about Platoon and the Vietnam War and his experience. Of course, you can find his book through OU Press. You can find it through his website as well. So if you want to find out more about Rob Thompson, you can go to @DrRobThompson, or you can go to drrobthompson.com. Find out more about his work. Thank you, of course, to the work of our producer, Fletcher Powell, who makes this show go. You can find him at Fletcher_Powell. And, of course, thank you so much to you guys as well. If you want to keep learning about HATM, you can find out more about us by following at Herbert History on Twitter. You can also find the historiansofthemovies.com. We are currently revising that site. That's going to be up and going, and we're starting to see some stuff on that soon. And that's going to be really exciting. So, other ways that you can continue to support the podcast is to leave reviews of the podcast on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, whatever it is that you listen to your podcasts on. If you would leave us a review, that helps the algorithms and all that kind of stuff. I'm still learning how all this stuff goes, guys. So thank you so much. And again, tune in this Sunday night on Amazon Prime and Twitter, because we're going to live tweet Hamburger Hill. We're going to kind of go 2 films this week to talk about Vietnam. Hope you can make it in. Thank you so much for being part of this show. This doesn't run without you. So thanks again for being here, and we will talk to you later. Ciao for now. Bye.